everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Huck. Today I am doing my spring DNFs. So these are going to be all the books that I DNF'd or did not finish over March, April, and May. This video is coming a little bit late. I'm a little behind on my videos, but let's just get started. I had 6 DNFs in the spring. The first one was I'll Give You the Sun by Gandhi Nelson. This is a YA contemporary, and I was listening to it as an audiobook, and I got, I think, about 50% of the way into it and just decided that I was not interested in it anymore. One of the things was that I didn't really like the use of like metaphor, I guess, in the book. The characters in this, the main character is an artist. He is seeing the world in a very creative way, not that it's actually happening, which at first I found kind of charming, but over time as I was reading it, I just got really tired of the amount of information that was given that was irrelevant to the story, because since these things were not actually happening and the metaphors being used just like didn't work for me, it ended up just being distracting from the story because it just became irrelevant information. And usually I'm someone who really enjoys metaphor used in books, but I just didn't really like the way it was done in this one. I also really just was not engaged with any of the characters that were in this. Like halfway through the book, I wasn't really attached to anybody that was in the story. There's also just so much miscommunication between characters, withholding information. There's a lot of jealousy and, you know, guilt, and like a lot of vindictiveness between characters, which I just wasn't enjoying. And since I didn't like the characters, I also kind of didn't care about any of it. What I ended up doing was I read a synopsis of the rest of the book to see if I was going to be interested in what happened, and I was just like, this is not interesting to me. It was just more of the characters miscommunicating, hurting each other, and then feeling guilty about it, and I just wasn't interested in the story, so I decided to DNF. My next DNF was This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El-Motar and Max Gladstone. This is an adult sci-fi novella that is kind of a romance between these two characters who are time traveling, and they're agents from different like agencies who are trying to control the flow of history with their time traveling, and they kind of send letters back and forth, but they don't all they're not actually in the form of like written letters. They come in all these like weird different forms, and I started out listening to this as an audiobook. That really wasn't working for me, so I decided to try reading it instead, just to see if maybe it would work better that way. And I ended up reading it actually as an ebook from my library, and like that just didn't work either. I mean, I'm not a fan of ebooks in general, so maybe the medium that I was reading it in wasn't working for me, but overall I just felt like I couldn't connect to the characters in this, and I just think the style of storytelling wasn't working for me. The style of like sending letters back and forth is not something that I generally like. If it works in a story for me, usually it's because there's a larger story and then there's like one letter or like a couple of letters sprinkled in between characters, but a story primarily told in the form of letters going back and forth, whether they're actually in like written letter form or not. It's just not a format that I like. I find it difficult to connect to the characters that way, and so I just ended up DNFing this one also. Then in April, I DNF'd Spindle Dagger by J. Anderson Coates, which I was very surprised about this DNF and very sad about it because I just recently hauled it right before I had read it. And this is a YA historical fantasy, I guess. I'm not actually sure if it's fantasy or if it's just historical fiction. I don't think I ever got to a real fantasy part. But we're following a girl who, it's set in Wales, and we're following a girl whose family was killed by a war band. She's the only survivor, and the only reason that she survived is because she convinced the leader of the war band that she has the favor of a saint that is Saint Ellen, and her name is Ellen, and so she was like, oh, we have this connection, and if you spare me and keep me near you, you will also have the saint's favor and she will protect you. And so that's how she survived, and now she travels with this warband who murdered her family. And the story starts 3 years after her family had been murdered, which is not where I was expecting it to start. I was expecting it to start like at the time when her family was murdered, but it started 3 years later, so she already has this established relationship with the warband and the leader of the warband, and it's a very like confusing relationship that they have, because she has become very attached to him, and she is also very dependent on him for her survival and all of that, which is understandable, but obviously she also hates him because he murdered her entire family, so it's a very conflicted relationship that they have. And this is one that I think really could have benefited from a prologue, which I think is an unusual thing for me to say, because I hate prologues in general, not a fan. But the point at which this book started, since it started 3 years after like these events that had literally formed her as a person and set up the whole scenario, it was a little confusing to jump into, and I don't think that it was very clear as to what happened 3 years ago and the fact that her family was murdered and kind of what her relationship to the warband was. That wasn't made clear through the text. I only knew the context from reading the description of the book, and I think that a book should have that context built into the book somewhere, whether it is through flashbacks, whether it's a prologue, whatever it is, that context needs to be in the book itself, not just in the blurb. Warnings on this for things like rape, PTSD, and flashbacks, death of a child or sibling, Stockholm syndrome, and maybe pedophilia. I have a question mark next to that one, and I don't remember the context of that note. So this also just has like a lot of, you know, content and trigger warnings. Also, it's another book that I just didn't feel connected to any of the characters. That is very often why I'll DNF a book, is if I just don't care about anyone or anything that's happening in it. And that is very much how I felt about this. I didn't feel like I really knew the main character, and it was just really boring. Also, the main character in this says the word play act so many times. Like, this is just a petty, like, irrelevant thing, but it got really annoying that I was like, you need to think of another word other than play act, because she says it so much. It was just so frustrating. But this is one that I would consider maybe continuing on. I think I got like 160 pages into it, and it's like probably, it's under 300 pages, so like maybe I would continue it just to see if it got better, but I also don't really want to. My next DNF was another surprise, so apparently April was a real surprising DNF month for me, which was The Wildwood by Charles DeLint. This is a contemporary fantasy set in, I think, Canada, in like the woods. It's following a artist who has kind of lost her inspiration and is trying to find it again. So she has been living in a cabin in the woods and trying to, you know, rekindle her artistic inspiration. And then she starts to feel like there may be fairies or something in the woods that are watching her, and it scares her, and she kind of is trying to figure out how to deal with that. So with this one, a lot of my complaint about it is it was super boring, and I didn't like the pacing. This book is very short. It is another one that this is just barely 200 pages, and it spends so much time of her just like debating whether fairies exist. And it's not even like her trying to find out if they exist. It's just like her in her own head kind of freaking out about it, trying to figure out or decide if she thinks fairies exist. And it just like wasn't very interesting, and I was like, at what point are we actually gonna get to the part where there are fairies, because I know from the synopsis that like there are fairies in this, and it just took such a long time. I also did not like the main character. She just was like really frustrating, and she was really pretentious. Like, I just felt like she was so pretentious, especially really pretentious about her art, that she just was getting on my nerves. The writing was kind of weird because it like switched between third person and first person, and I could not tell why it would do that. I think it was trying to have like also larger themes to it, especially about like environmental themes, but I just felt like they were very heavy-handed, and since I was not engaged in the story, I was not like that invested in them. Like, I love books that have like larger themes or messages to them, but you also have to like write a compelling story with engaging characters, and this just like didn't have that. And overall, I just felt like this really lacked emotion to it. But one of the things that also made me DNF this is that when she finally does find the fairies in this, there is this whole part of the story that is about like the queen of the fairies and having problems with like infertility and miscarriages. So I would definitely also put content warnings on this for those topics. But I think those were supposed to be like a larger metaphor for like the environment and how humans are destroying the environment. But again, since I felt like this story really was like lacking in emotion, I didn't like the way it was treating those topics, because those of course are very sensitive and emotional, and can be traumatic experiences for people. And it just felt like the author was kind of using these highly emotional experiences to kind of make his point about environmentalism without really being careful and, you know, treating those experiences with the sensitivity that would be necessary. I just didn't like that, and I just wasn't enjoying the book overall. So once I got to that part, I was just like, I don't need to finish this. And I got pretty far into it. I was like, let's see, 130 pages into it, and I only had like 70 pages left, and it's a pretty short book. I was just like, we're not doing this. I don't want to read this anymore. Now we're on to the May DNFs. So the first book that I DNF'd in May was Between the Water and the Woods by Simone Snaith. And this is a YA fantasy that takes place in a small village, where they have a kind of like a moat that goes all the way around the village to separate them from the woods, because there are these like evil magical monsters that live in the woods but are afraid of water, and so nobody is allowed to cross the water or go into the woods. But the monsters haven't been seen in a very long time, but then one day our main character is playing with her brother and some of their friends, and one of them goes to the woods, and they see what they think is a monster, and so then they have to travel to the capital to report this sighting to the king. So that's what the story is. That's not what I was expecting this to be, because I thought that this was going to be more about like the village dealing with the fact that there are monsters in the woods, but more so it's about them traveling to the capital. And so a lot of the story just turned into it being about like these people who are from a small village experiencing the big city for the first time, and like there's a large part of it where it's just them like wandering around the big city and being like in awe of everything, which like wasn't really relevant to what was going on. It was literally just them like exploring the city, and I was like, why is this happening? And it's not like a very long book, so that was a large chunk of the book. Also, some of the things that I was really excited about for this were like, you know, creepy woods vibes, that there would be nature magic, that kind of stuff, and it just like did not have enough of that. It had a little tiny bit. It really didn't have a lot of the creepy woods vibes unless like it got into that in the second half of the book. But for the first half, that was not really a thing. And she does have nature magic. She can like control water plants for some reason. But like there's almost nothing about it. There's a romance in this that I also really didn't like. I felt like it was very surface level. It didn't make sense why the characters really liked each other. The guy was just like really rude and I did not enjoy him. He was just like really annoying. Also, just like the writing of their romance was, one, really clunky and awkward, and two, just like very cringy. The whole romance was super cringy and I hated it. Also, the main character, there's a lot about how she's not like other girls and she's better than other girls because one, she doesn't know that she's attractive. That's one of her main personality features because she doesn't have a whole lot of them. But she doesn't know that she's attractive, and she also does not follow trends like the other girls, so that makes her better. And she is not boy crazy or fangirling over like famous guys in this world, because she's pretty much the only female character in the book. The only other female characters that show up are other girls who like know that they're pretty, who do follow fashion trends, and who are like boy obsessed, and they're only there for like brief moments so that she can be compared to them, so that we can see that she's so much better than them. And I got about 180 pages into it and just was not enjoying it, could not stand how cringy it was. I hated the romance, like just did not want to finish. And my last DNF for the spring was Tarot by Marissa Kennerson. This is another YA fantasy that is based on tarot cards. And so there are like different magical lands that are based on the different suits in a tarot deck, and like the personalities of the people are kind of based on the different characters within like the major arcana of the tarot deck. And I just thought that sounded like a really interesting premise. And this one, like, mostly I really didn't like the writing and I thought it was really boring. The writing of this just felt very unpolished, like it felt like it just wasn't done. And then I just felt like the story was really boring. I think the alignments between the characters and the tarot decks and like the archetypes of tarot was really interesting. That was the most interesting part about this. That's what originally drew me to this, and I did like that, but I wasn't interested in the characters or the plot, and the writing just made everything so clunky and feel so unfinished. I just wasn't into it. So those are all of the books that I DNF'd in the spring. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, bye!